Noswaith dda a chroeso i'r ddarlith heno. Good evening and welcome everyone to this evening's lecture. So in conjunction with the Wales Gene Park, we're very fortunate indeed to host Dr. Neil Stevens from the University of Birmingham this evening. Neil completed his PhD at Cardiff University School of Social Sciences in 2005. He then continued to work within that department as a researcher within the ESRC Centre for the Economic and Social Aspects of Genomics, CESAGEN, where he stayed for the next 10 years. Following his time in Cardiff, Neil moved to Brunel University, London, where he was awarded a Wellcome Trust Research Fellowship to pursue his research on big tissue and society that reflects the advent of mass-produced tissues. Neil moved to the University of Birmingham in 2021 to take up a senior lectureship in technology and society. A key focus of Neil's work has been innovation in biotechnology, whereby he has conducted research into the politics of stem cell science, mitochondrial donation, and cultured meat, amongst other topics. Over his career, Neil has conducted a diversity of public and policy engagement activities. This includes multiple appearances in newspapers and broadcasts across the world, as well as speaking at events such as the Edinburgh Book Festival and New Scientist Live. He has an interest in qualitative methods, having published multiple papers on this topic, and is an editorial board member for the journal Qualitative Research. As world population numbers continue to rise, placing ever greater pressure on our planet's resources, as I'm sure you are all, looking forward this evening to learning of the potential role that cultured meat has to play in satisfying future food demands. Neil, it's a great pleasure to have you this evening. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. Let me share some slides with you. Okay, so no, it hasn't. There we go. I think you can now see my slides and just my slides, which means I can begin. Thank you very much once again. As you heard, my name is Neil Stevens. I'm based at the University of Birmingham. I'm here today to talk about something called cultured meat. Cultured meat is something I've been studying since 2008, and it's a really distinctive and innovative technology that's trying to change what and how we eat. Here's some pictures of cultured meat. In fact, these are not even the most recent pictures. These are pictures from a few years ago that show these really innovative products where people are trying to make familiar meat products, sausages, burgers, chicken nuggets, meatballs. But instead of killing an animal to take the muscle, they're trying to grow the muscle from cells. That's fundamentally what the talk is about today. Why people are doing this, how it's coming into being, and some of the challenges that this could bring to us as people in democratic societies, right? How do we think about this? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? How is it done? So the logic behind it is very similar to tissue engineering, as you see in biomedicine. It's about taking cells, controlling the fate of those cells, how they're grown. In this instance, it's taking cells typically from livestock animals. Actually, there are some people that use other types of animals, but overwhelmingly, it's cells from cows, cells from pigs and chicken, and also a range of fish and seafood. Now, you're already at one of the first technical issues. Where do you get the cell from? What type of cell? And there's all types of embryonic and induced cells and cells from muscle cells that can be taken. But once you've got your cells, you then have to put them in a liquid, a culture media that gives the nutrients to the cells. And there you have another technical issue. How do you make that culture media? What goes in it? How do you make it cheap and efficient? Once in the media, the idea is that the cells will start to grow. I'll do that so you can see my hands. There's no point me doing hand gestures down here. The cells start to grow, and as you develop your system into larger scales, you put them into a large vat called a bioreactor. Your next question, what type of bioreactor are you going to use? How is it going to work? You might have multiple bioreactors for different purposes. You might have some to get lots of cells, and then another bioreactor, another media to try to get the particular type of cells that you want. And then you take those muscle cells, maybe fat cells, some people are trying to grow fat, and you turn them into a familiar product shape, a sausage, a burger, and then you sell it as food. That's the logic. In fact, not only is it the logic, that's what's happening. Cultured meat is already legally available in Singapore and in the US, and has been for a couple of years in Singapore. I'll get to Singapore. So just to be clear, what I'm talking about is cultured meat, and that's different to plant-based meat. You've probably heard a lot about plant-based meat. This is where you take beans or other, plant ingredients and make them into something that looks like a familiar meat burger or sausage. Lots of innovation in that world, but that's a different technology. Related because they're there for similar purposes, but I'm talking about meat grown from cells. Why? Why would someone want to do this? As I go along, I'll be saying a few more things about me. At this point, I'm going to say that I'm a sociologist, and I'm interested in tracking the emergence of the community of people who are producing cultured meat and the politics of that. So one thing that I do is document all the different reasons that people give for wanting to support this technology. And then you can start to interrogate those narratives for why people want to support this technology. And they've shifted a little bit over time. Some are more visible than others, but a very prominent one is the environmental narrative. The idea that cultured meat is a way of making meat compared to livestock that uses less land, less water, less energy, has lower greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, these things need to be proven. The idea that it uses less land is sort of pretty generally accepted. The energy usage, you have to see until you're doing it at scale. There's predictions on both sides. There's also the idea that this is a way of making meat that causes less animal suffering, a way of killing less animals, keeping animals in confined conditions in much lower numbers, perhaps actually still killing some animals, perhaps still having some animals. Other visions see themselves as, there was a term going around for a while called the post-animal bioeconomy, the idea that this could lead to an animal-free meat system. Not so many people push that hard anymore. This was more sort of 5-6 years ago. The idea of making a healthier meat, a meat where you can engineer nutrition, where you can control what goes into it, where there is no use of antibiotics, and a meat where you can prevent zoonotic diseases because this is meat that is not produced in a space like farms with other animals around. It's produced in a sterile condition. Those are the three most visible arguments, but there are other narratives that float around as well, some that you hear more at different points and within the community in different places. The idea that this is an opportunity for food innovation, to make food that looks completely different to food that we know before. Some people do this, but actually in practice, overwhelmingly, most cultured meat companies today are trying to make meat that is exactly the same as what you know. They're not trying to make radically different cubes or ladder-shaped sausages or something. A small number are, but most they want to make sausages as you know it. So we don't see this food innovation narrative as much as you have at times. There's also this idea that this is a way of making meat for space travel. In fact, some of the very earliest work, as I'll mention shortly, was really entirely focused around this idea of how to produce meat if you can't get cows in space. And then, of course, the idea that this is a way of making money for companies, but also for nations. This is something that in some instances is being built into the industrial strategy of certain countries as a way of getting a new route into the economy of food production. Early on in these talks, it's always important to do a little thing about what it's called. I use the term cultured meat. I've been using that for a long time. Many people still do, but also another really regularly used term within the community is cultivated meat. They all mean the same thing. Another one that you hear is cell-based meat. There's one called clean meat, although you don't hear this as much as you did a few years ago. That's kind of fallen out of fashion within the community. But there's also a set of other names that are less preferred, shall we say, by people working on cultured meat. Things like in vitro meat, lab-grown meat, Frankenstein meat. These are terms that you sometimes see in the media more and are, not particularly friendly, shall we say, to the technology. I think this is important because as a sociologist, I'm interested in how people make sense of this technology. And one of the ways that you make sense of something is through what you call it, and how different terms give you a different sense of what it is that you're trying to produce and what it is about the world that you're trying to change. I think this is why cultivated meat has become popular, because it's slightly more middle ground than some of the others. Clean meat was seen as very provocative and insulting, frankly, towards farmers because it implied that traditional meat was dirty. That's why people don't use that term anymore. Cultivated seems to be this sort of happy middle ground for people within the community. Okay, let me talk about how this came into being. The idea of making meat without killing animals is probably something you've come across in science fiction previously, Star Trek, many other things. You can actually trace back, in fact, John Miller has traced back early examples of this type of thing to 1881 and 1897 novels. Mizora, A Prophecy, and Two Planets feature stories of future wonderful worlds where this type of technology exists. And there were many other variants in the 100 years since. But I want to skip forward. I'm talking about not the vision, but the accomplishment or the attempted accomplishment of doing this, which takes us to the millennium. So around the time of the millennium, there were two groups who were working on doing this. The first, the image that I have here, is the group funded by NASA that I mentioned earlier. Actually, NASA have been funding this again more recently, but there was a gap. But there was an initial pioneer, Maurice Benjaminson, based in Truro College, which is just north of New York, who got money to expand the muscles of goldfish as an experimental procedure to think about how meat in space could be produced. In fact, they made some meat and they had a sniffing panel where they smelt it to see how good and how appealing it was. The other early group went as far as eating it. So this is the tissue culture and art practice. This is a set of bioartists who also, not long after the millennium, Yoneza and Oron Katz, set up a number of art installations. This one pictured here primarily is in France, in Nantes, and they grew frog muscle in this. The black tent is like a portable laboratory, and in there they grew some frog muscle, which then they consumed and ate in a staged dinner party as a piece of art, really, to provoke reflection on what this technology could mean, what it could be to eat frog while the frogs that were being eaten were still sat at the head of the dinner table. I'm jumping forward a little more. This is a new stage in the story. Around 2005, the Dutch government were very concerned about the environmental impact of protein consumption, and they invested some money in research looking at using insects for food. And they invested the first large amount of money in what at the time was called in vitro meat. Here we have a picture of Professor Henk Haagsman, who was running that group. And at the bottom, there's a picture of Willem van Aelen, who was this incredibly charismatic but quite forceful entrepreneur who was trying to connect the dots to make this happen. He really made a difference in bringing the Dutch government into bringing this initial money. The Dutch group also included another character. His name was Mark Post. This is Mark Post, a scientist from Maastricht University who produced the world's first cultured burger. There it is. Although kind of, they actually produced two. This was the one for the photo shots. The other one was used in a press conference I was lucky enough to go to on the 5th of August, 2013. It was in a theatre in London, and it was streamed around the world. It was full of journalists. It was explicitly intended to launch this product, prototype. It's still, in my mind, formulating the vision. So they had two journalists there on stage, food critics, who were able to eat it and taste it. They said it had good mouthfeel, but it lacked salt. It was very hot as well. It was fresh from the frying pan. But the event also gave a narrative, a story about what cultured meat is for. The vision that this is meat exactly as we know meat today. The idea that this is primarily about environmental issues and that primarily the people who would eat it are meat eaters. The idea that this isn't a meat alternative for vegetarian or vegans, but this is something that anyone who eat meat today would happily shift over to. That was the vision. I said before, I'm a sociologist interested in the cultural politics of the emergence of this technology. And that's really important to me because prior to this, exactly what cultured meat was for, is it for space? Is it meat? Is it a meat alternative? This was still a bit vague. It was such an unusual thing to be doing, right? And here we see someone quite clearly articulate a clear vision for how we should all understand it. And this vision, in my opinion, still stands strong in the cultured meat world today. So 2013 seems to be something of a moment of change within the community. Prior to that, most of the research was in universities. It was relatively small scale. In fact, the university staff were often struggling for funding. But this burger was funded by Sergey Brin, who's one of the co-founders of Google. And it showed the beginning of Silicon Valley money and broader US-led investment culture coming into cultured meat. After 2013, we see much more venture capital interest. We see the first company formed in 2015. Who are these people? Today they're called Upside Foods. At the time, they were called Memphis Meats. And they were in an incubator. So this is an economic incubator, right? It's a 3-month course basically that you go on with venture capitalists. They give them access to lab space and they teach them how to run a startup company. And this changed the way that culture meat was represented because suddenly it was linked to commercial interests and it was linked to a much more a very different presentation style, much more like a kind of an Apple sort of vision of slick technology. The graphic design improved massively, and there's an extent to which the visions for how soon this could be accomplished and how efficiently it would be accomplished, and the certainty with which it was accomplished was increased a little. Because this was now in the world of commercial venture capital, and it's a very different way of talking about technological innovation. This company is still going. They were the first. They're one of the biggest, if not the biggest company in the world right now. And I'll be returning to some of their exploits towards the end. Here's a close-up on their first meatball from 2015. I know everyone likes to see the pictures, and I have plenty of pictures. This was followed by a whole set of other companies coming in. It was New Age Meats, who were founded in 2018, also in the San Francisco Bay Area, also involved in these kind of circuits of venture capital. Some of these early venture capitalists were actively vegan venture capitalists. So these are people who want to bring into being a vegan world or a world with much less animal suffering and doing it through strategic economic investment. Increasingly over time, other types of venture capitalists, and now we see a much broader investor portfolio with, big players in pharmaceuticals and in the food industry investing in these companies. This is another early example, Wild Type working on seafood, and Blue Nalu doing the same with tuna. All of these images that I'm showing you, these are, as you can tell by the photography, these are promotional images developed by companies to try to normalize this technology. From the burger all the way through, I think there's been a lot of work from people within the community to stop this from seeming bizarre, unusual, challenging, and make it something that resonates, make it something that seems everyday, but also delicious. So I find these photographs fascinating. You can always tell they spend a lot of time making what is sometimes relatively small volumes look as so full of sort of a salivating experience as they possibly can. Blue Nalu This is another US-based company, also provided some images of what they think their production facility will look like in the future. So this is an image that they circulated, that they actually circulated this before the pandemic, as they were raising investment to give a sense of what they think the commercial scale can look like. This is their design of a 150,000 square foot food facility, which they believe would produce enough food to feed 10 to 20 million people. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. This is the internal design in the picture in the top right. You can kind of see from the right-hand side that the food comes in, and then you have this set of small grey circles with blue dots. That's rooms full of bioreactors, the vats that cultured meat is grown in, and then it goes out to a food processing plant to produce the final product, and then you see the trucks that will drive off to the supermarkets in the local area. They have this vision for multiple of these plants. No one's operating at this scale at the moment, but I think it's important to give a sense of the scale and the ambition and the idea that this really is a technology to fundamentally, so the vision goes, change what we eat. This is a British company. They're now called Uncommon. They used to be called Higher Stakes. They're based in Cambridge, and this is their pork belly and their bacon. Goodness me, when did they start? They started around 2015, I would imagine, as a small startup, and they're increasingly growing new investment rounds into a bigger company. They're not the only ones in the UK. This is Ivy Farm Technologies, based in Oxford. There's around 20 companies in the UK right now. But Uncommon and Ivy Farms are relatively distinctive in that they're what they call full stack companies, or fully vertically integrated. This means that these are companies that are trying to make meat. They're trying to make things to sell to the consumer, but they also want to do all the bits in between. They want to be able to make their own culture media. They want to be able to get their own sales sources. They want to be able to do the entire process within the company. Upside Food, Memphis Meats, the people that I talked about earlier, and all of the earlier companies all had this long-term vision of doing everything themselves. Increasingly, we see companies like that become a lower proportion of the total companies, as we see much more B2B companies, so companies that sell to other companies. And I think this shows a maturing of the sector. So you are seeing companies that specialize in culture media. There's a British company called Maltus Media who do exactly that. Companies that specialize in microcarriers, and microcarriers are these little things that you put into the liquid in the bioreactor that you hope that the cells will bind to help the cells grow. And all kinds of companies, growth factors, other little bits that you put in that companies specialize in. So it's a diversifying market within the set of companies who are all working in their own ways to making new types of meat, or new ways of making meat. This is a company from South Africa. There's not many companies in Africa, but there are companies in many parts of the world. There's an increasing number in Latin America, for example. This company work on meatballs and burgers. This is a company called Aleph Farms who they try to make more complex meats, so things like steaks. This is their prototype ribeye steak on the left. So if you can imagine, making a sausage it's not easy, but it's relatively easy, or a burger, because it's a processed meat. You just need to get the cells and then you kind of squish it together. If you want to make a steak, you have to have lots of different types of tissue, muscle cells, fat cells, layered in quite a complex but familiar way. Some people are looking at 3D printing as ways of doing this, but this is kind of next level technical hurdles of complex 3D tissues like steaks, like pork chops. And this is a company who are from Israel, and Israel is one of the countries with the leading, largest number of companies, certainly per capita, in the world, along with Singapore. There's a lot of companies in Asia, and Singapore has really become a place where we see a lot of this. I think Singapore is really, really interesting. This is Shiok Meats. They're a company running out of Singapore, focused on seafood. So what we've seen since the burger, the 2013 burger, is a diversifying of a central narrative. So let me remind you, the central narrative was articulated around this burger. It's this idea that this is meat exactly as we know it. So the vision goes that this is meat that's good for the environment, and that this is meat that meat eaters will eat. And that's become the core vision that most of the companies revolve around, but they still need to differentiate themselves. So especially for investors and for publics, they have to show that they're doing the same as the others, but they're doing something a little bit different in order to get the investment. Because if they're not doing something different, why would you invest in them when you can invest in the company that's already a year or 2 or 3 years ahead? And one of the ways they do this is by going to different markets. We're the first company in this country, in that country, or a different species. We're the first company, working in pig or duck or something else, or different cell lines or different products. Shiok were one of the very early companies to work in seafood, and they were one of the very early companies in Asia. And Singapore is a big part of the story. I mentioned earlier that cultured meat is now available, and it first became available in Singapore in late 2020. We'd heard talk of it possibly becoming available in Singapore for some time, but a lot of this is unclear. You're waiting for things to happen. There's sort of rumors, but companies stay quiet about some of the details. That's a regular feature. And the first company was a company called Just, under their Good Meat label. This is an American company. They had hoped to launch in America, but there was this complex legal dispute in America between the USDA, the United States, the USDA, Department for Agriculture in the US, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, about who had the right and where the remit lay between the two. And there was a lot of negotiations between how to line that up. In the intervening period, Just had been approaching other nations to see who was interested in supporting this, who was interested in doing the hard work, the difficult work of putting a regulatory process in place. Singapore was the answer. It's difficult to put a regulatory process in place because you have to work out how are you going to prove it's safe, which means you need to map out all the potential risk factors in a radically different type of process. What are you going to allow in relationship to the cells? What are you going to allow in relationship to the media? What kind of monitoring practices does a company need to have on its facility? How do they assure sufficient sterility? And what do you decide that level of sufficient sterility should be? What kind of recording and documenting practices do you need to put in place? And it took the Singapore Food Agency 2 years to put this framework together in dialogue with the companies that were working in Singapore and stakeholders beyond Singapore before this could come into being. It came into being on the 19th of December 2020. A restaurant in Singapore launched, and for the first time ever, people bought cultured meat. Chicken nuggets, 2 chicken nuggets, 25 Singapore dollars. I understand they're being sold at a loss. The company, this is essentially a way of the company demonstrating the viability of the technology, but it's not a way of making money at this stage. You can still buy them in Singapore, but it's in low quantities. And the very first meal was sold to a teacher with some school children who'd been invited along to trial this. I should say this was still in the tail end of the pandemic. I know many talk that COVID hasn't gone, right? But the period of lockdowns was still ongoing. And in Singapore, you were only allowed to have 5 people in a room, certainly in terms of a restaurant setting. So there was a special room made, walled off with cameras and beautiful decoration that signified the environmental mission of the foodstuff. And these young people were given the opportunity to buy it for the first time. After that, they have a number of guests and opportunities for people to try it. I myself was in Singapore last summer, talking to people who work in cultured meat there. My colleague Mariella, who I was with, we tried to see if we could get some. At the time, it was available on an app similar to Deliveroo, as we have here, where you order it. But it was only available at 11 a.m. on Thursdays. 10:59, we were sat there with the app, and it comes available, sold out. Within a second. Which I think says something about the volumes that are available that day, because it's still expensive, because it's still difficult. And simply having a facility that's big enough to produce vast volumes is still beyond where the technology is. Most people are moving into pilot plant level. These are the chicken nuggets from Just that are available in Singapore. But often people talk about why Singapore. Typically, the answer that you get for why Singapore was the first place in the world to do this is because it's a high-tech, ambitious nation with food security issues. And that is absolutely true. So 90% of the food in Singapore is imported. And it's a country that knows a lot about climate change. It's hot there, and as a small island, it can experience extreme weather. But I always think it's important to realize that there's a broader component to this, which is related to the politics of Singapore as a nation. So Singapore is not a particularly old nation. It emerged out of colonial and wartime Japanese rule. And it has a government who you can vote for. There's democracy there, but okay, I dropped out there, I think. Let me reshare my screen. Okay. Hopefully this is still working. Hopefully you've all got me.
Yeah,
thank you. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Yeah, so Singapore is sometimes described as a benevolent dictatorship. And essentially, it's an economically successful, competitive country, that sees itself as at the position of a kind of an Eats Meets West investment center. But people don't have all the political freedoms that they do in the UK, for example. And I've been reading the work of a lot of scholars from Singapore talking about the politics within the nation. And they talk about how the social contract essentially operates, that people that are living in Singapore are to a certain extent prepared to give up a level of the political freedoms that we experience in exchange for a government who promised to deliver economic success largely through technological innovation and engagement with investment cultures, with Western and Eastern investment meeting in a single place. So this means that for me, cultured meat is also part of this broader political story of how Singapore operates as a sort of a single party state. I think they've only had 4 prime ministers in the many decades that they've existed. And it's uncommon for there to be electoral shocks in Singapore. The government is premised upon trust in the wise leadership of an elite few who understand how investment works, who understand how capitalism works, and understand how technological innovation delivers success. That bit's often left out of the story. So as a social scientist, I think it's important to bring that back. I've already told you that it's also available in the US. This happened relatively recently, earlier this year, when Memphis Meats, who are now called Upside, the company that made the first meatballs in 2015, and Just Good Meat, the people that launched in Singapore, were both granted licenses for sale. This is the Upside fried tempura. Again, still small volumes. These are only available in sort of select restaurants. They normally go with restaurant for a little while, then go to another one, and then this is what they've been doing in Singapore. We may well see it in the US as well, circling through spaces to raise the visibility of this still relatively emergent technology. There are products, I understand, under review in the UK. It typically takes about 2 years it took 2 years in the US as well, for a regulatory process to be put into place. So maybe 18 months from now, maybe a little bit longer, we may start to see the first small-scale restaurant sales here. Just checking my time. I think that cultured meat has seen impressive success in the 15 years that I've been watching it. Well, I started looking at this in 2008. It was really very small people. There weren't small people. There were a small number of people doing work that was seen as really strange and really speculative. There's over 100 countries in the world now. It's legally available. There's been over $1 billion of investment. Things have been going well. There've been no major problems, but some difficulties are starting to appear. I'm not saying this because I think that everything's starting to go on the dip, but this isn't an easy thing to do. So these include, for example, New Age Meats, the company that I mentioned earlier, who started in 2018. This year, they became the first, I would say, high-profile company to go out of business. Some smaller companies have gone out of business because, companies come and go in the very early stages all the time. But this was one that many people thought were quite a serious player, but the financial issues weren't working with for them, particularly around the investment culture. This is related to the broader economic turnover in recent years. There's simply less investment money around. Shiok, who I spoke about earlier in Singapore, they had to make a number of staff redundant earlier this year and late last year. They've refocused a bit. Again, an early success story, finding that actually making demonstration products is doable, that getting a team together of brilliant people is doable, but moving into those next steps of making it cheaper, of getting it at scale, things start to get more difficult. Don't get me wrong. There are companies upside, for example, who are further ahead than these two companies were at this point, but difficulties are arising. Equally, Just, the company I was talking about earlier, who sell in both Singapore and US, have recently have an issue with a bioreactor company. These are the big vats. They agreed to buy these 250,000 litre bioreactors, a number of them, to make cultured meat. And the story that we're getting, there's only so much in the public domain, is that they haven't been able to keep up the payments on these bioreactors. In general, the level of funding has been going down this year, as I say, related to the changing economic environment. Over $1 billion was invested last year, 2022. Up to this point so far in this year, we're at $289 million. So that's still a lot of money, but a lot less than previously. I'm not saying this because I think the sector is about to collapse, but we're seeing real difficulties for some of the leading companies. As well as difficulties, there are questions. I started off at the beginning by saying there was a vision to change the world, the environment, how we relate to animals, how we relate to our health. But whether that can be delivered upon is uncertain. There's really big questions about how successful it will be. Will it be commercially viable, simply technically and economically at scale? Will it be good enough? Will it be safe enough and cheap enough? Actually, safety looks like we're going to have safety. There could, there might be particular products that have issues, but in general, it's now legally available. People say it tastes good, or it tastes like food as we know today. The cheapness is not there yet. This is still an expensive process. Also, uncertainties around the environmental impact. Exactly how much energy will it use? It relies upon needing renewable energy to fuel these large factories with these bioreactors that you have to heat up. And maybe sometimes you have to cool them down as well. And there's all kinds of energy consumption that's going on. And there's also questions about what will actually happen in the market if it's used at scale. The logic is absolutely that if you have a high level of real livestock animal consumption now, that if cultured meat consumption goes up, then livestock consumption will go down in an equal amount. But it's possible that cultured meat consumption could go up and livestock consumption might not necessarily go down in the same kind of way. We have a growing population. People like to eat meat. So really, the environmental impact of its use in practice is something that people speculate on. Some people even model, but I think it's not something we can know for sure. Questions, of course, about the impact on rural economies, on farmers, in different parts of the world. If this is successful and livestock meat goes down, where are those hits on farming going to happen? Again, there are projections, but I think we can't tell at this stage. And what will people think about it? Will people want to eat it? Will it change how people think about food? Because food and meat is so visceral. It's how people feed their families. It's tied up with identity. Notions of power and masculinity in many societies are tied to eating real meat. And what does it mean for cultured meat to come into this space, into the family home, and into our food culture and our food traditions? Again, there's a lot of initial studies on this, focus groups, surveys, but we're in a context of a changing information context. And I think it's difficult to predict long-term what this may be. It's important, I believe, to understand that this isn't just an experiment with cells. This is an attempt to change the world. It's an attempt to change the agricultural system, the climate, and our relationship to animals. Here it is. Does this change your relationship to animals? Does this change how you think about the environment? Does this change how you think about food culture? These are open questions. I'd love to know what you think. I'm happy to answer any more questions. My name is Neil Stevens. Here's some papers I've written if you want to see. These are all open access things. You can read them. There's my Twitter. I still call it Twitter. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. I certainly enjoyed it. It was a fascinating overview, and we're very fortunate to have someone to have been involved in this field from the very outset. So I'd encourage our audience this evening to kindly start putting their questions into a Q&A that I can then feed to Neil. Neil, perhaps I could just ask a quick question whilst
please.
our audience is starting to provide you with questions. And
Yeah.
it goes back to that issue of safety that you mentioned.
Yes.
Obviously, growing large numbers of cells in culture, there's the possibility that some of these cells might become what we term transformed. So cancer might be a potential issue. So what have groups been doing to kind of assuage concerns in that domain?
Yeah, absolutely. So I talked early on about how the language is important, and sometimes people talk about the potential for cells to do things that aren't anticipated, and sometimes people talk about cancerous cells, and this is certainly one of the idea is taken very seriously, but this is certainly one of the pieces of language that people in the community are keen to avoid. It's one of the ones that they're often worried of that for good reason, that people will become scared of this very unusual technology. So there's been a number of safety initiatives. There's been there's a couple of sort of NGOs active in the sector. There's one called New Harvest. There's another one called GFI, and they've done a range of sort of consultation exercises where they allow people to share information about their processes, and they try to articulate potential risks, potential forms of contaminants. So I'm not the technical expert that can talk about exactly the types of tests that have gone into being. But one of the things that's interesting about the differences between the Singapore and the US case, which reflects their broader regulatory cultures, is that when the product was licensed in Singapore, all of the safety data was not revealed to the public. But in the US system, where have different notions of transparency because it's a different form of governance, all this information was made available. So these types of tests are out there for those who are happy to dig around the complex websites of the USDA and the FDA.
Sure. I'm sure it's been done. So we have a question about, does lab-grown meat have the same nutritional value as animal meat? Also, is the process quicker or not? Even is there scope to actually enhance the properties of nutritional properties of cultured meat?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it should be quicker. I mean, one of the reasons why there's complexities about the likely environmental impact of cultured meat is that it depends what species you're comparing it to, because cattle, cows, they live, for years before they're slaughtered, using a lot of energy, whereas, chickens, it's closer to weeks that you count their lifespan in, right? So there's very different energy inputs, but also very different time frames. That said, cultured meat is intended to be quicker than most of those things. You're not sort of brewing it for years. The cells multiply, they sort of double relatively frequently. And some of the products, there's a lot of talk about hybrid products, which would be a combination of fat cells and muscle cells with plant-based materials. So essentially you would bulk it out with some soya or some pea protein or something like that. I think there were two parts to that question. The nutritional value.
The value,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, again, so the products that are available today are, people hope, will not be as good as the products that will be available in the future. They're certainly not identical to meat products today, livestock meat products at this moment. That's simply not there. People seem to be relatively optimistic about the nutritional profile. And to go to your point, there certainly is the option to try to engineer additional nutrition. Indeed, there's some groups who talk about a possible use of cultured meat is actually as medicine, in that cultured meat could be engineered for people with very particular health needs, to be given certain types of meat that particularly address their conditions. So, this comes a bit of a regular response, but it's kind of an open question that there's aspirations for success in all of these areas, and we have to sort of wait and see.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, Neil, has a detailed comparison been done between lab-grown meat and plant-based meat? Issues like cost, taste, environmental aspects, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, plant-based meats itself is a pretty diverse range of foods and technologies. There haven't been independent studies of cultured meat. There's lots of intellectual property. There's relatively small volumes. It's still a highly competitive investment industry at the moment. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of collaboration between companies. They communicate a lot, but they're still, there hasn't. They still hold on to you can't buy it in a supermarket, so you can't go off and run tests on it. I mean, at this point, the vast majority of
we seem to have lost Neil temporarily. Hopefully we can get him back. Neil,
Hi.
Hi, we just lost you temporarily there.
Yeah, I know. My Zoom crashed. In fact, it looks like you've got two of me, but I'll carry on.
Can't be bad.
Could you remind me the question?
It was the comparison between
Plant-based. Yeah. So I mean, plant-based in itself is, of course, very diverse. You would have to be pretty bad at making plant-based meat currently for it to be more expensive and to use more energy than cultured meat. They're on different scales at the moment. Sorry to repeat the answer, but the aspiration is that they will be similar. They are not at the moment.
Yeah. And maybe just one quick follow-up question on that. Where are plant-based meats up to versus animal meat in terms of nearness to the marketplace?
Okay, so I mean, there's the distinction between plant-based meat and cultured meat. The cultured meats, as I've been saying, are very limited market availability, but you can get plant-based meats in most Tesco's and most supermarkets and right now. I still think that plant-based meats is a space where you will see lots of innovation still. They can get better. And as I said earlier, there could be a really interesting merging of the two, of plant-based and cultured meats being brought together to make cheaper, tastier types of foods. It's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, no, I could see that. A quick one. When do you think cultured meat might be available in the UK?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I'm right in saying that the applications have gone in this calendar year. I understand there's two. I might be wrong about that, but this is the talk that you hear. There's currently 2. There might be others. There might be more than that we don't know about, but there's talk that there's 2 that people are aware of. As I say, it's normally taken about 2 years for the regulators to really come together and work out what they're doing. It might now be quicker that the US have done it, because, as I say, their materials are public. But I mean, obviously, the Food Standards Agency in the UK are the people who do this, and I know they are doing it, and they're taking it very seriously. It involves a lot of learning for them because this is such a completely different type of food to what we've dealt with before. But sort of 2 years would be a sensible guess. It might be sooner. But again, I would anticipate that being relatively small volumes in possibly expensive restaurants, or it would be select places where possibly being sold at a loss as part of a promotional strategy, essentially. So like in Singapore, for a while, they were selling them from just like a food truck, for example, in some of the local markets as well in Singapore, where the price differential is just completely different. But it will be. It's coming. This is not, it won't be in big volumes, but it will be here certainly within 4 years.
Right.
I would have thought.
Going back to the issues around environmental impact, then Neil, we could, justifiably argue that maybe you're going to reduce the methane output per kilogram of meat as a result of going to cultured products. But it's not going to get around the issues of carbon dioxide, is it, potentially, in terms of, well, I don't know, in terms of how the key issue is how you provide the energy to heat these incubators is going to be the key. And if they are, I suppose you'd argue, maybe green sources, then it will potentially reduce carbon dioxide. But if not, then there are still issues around CO2, I imagine, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this issue of the differing impact of methane and CO2, right? And that methane hits hard and high, but sort of dissipates, whereas CO2 stays in the atmosphere. And all of these issues, because there's people always talk, rightly, as you did, about the inputs in the production, but to a certain extent, like, if this is really going to impact, the impact isn't so much just in the production itself, it's what difference it makes to the market more broadly, what other meats are still being produced or not being produced. And this, to a certain extent, I was about to say it's uncertain, and it is uncertain, but it also depends on policy. It also depends on having governments who want to see that kind of shift happen and are prepared to take, I think certainly in the UK, you would see political damage if you were to say that you wanted to do something that was going to damage the livestock industry here, right? I mean, there was talk during the Conservative Party conference, right, about there was a suggestion that, I think it was intended to be a humorous suggestion, that the Labour Party were considering a meat tax, which they weren't. But it was, but the kind of the response to that demonstrated that the strong political hesitancy about policies that may undermine existing farming industry. So the environmental impact is not just what goes into the bioreactor. How do you fuel the bioreactor? It's what happens in the market beyond it.
Sure. Very interesting. Have there been cases of disease associated with lab-grown meat? I guess that's still premature, but any comments on that?
That no one that I know of has got ill or unwell from consuming it. We're still talking about relatively. We're talking about, I'm guessing, but I would imagine like 1,000 people or something in the world have probably eaten it. It might be because a lot of the companies are quite big, and most of the people in the companies get to try it at some point. I think Upside Foods is about 400 members of staff now. I mean, it's one of the things that people in the community worry about, that one of the early people to eat it were then ill, whether it was directly unwell, whether it was directly related or not. It would be a difficult PR situation to deal with. I think that I had more questions about safety before the regulators started coming in. And I mean, in any food regulation, it's not about guaranteeing safety, it's about managing risk. And increasingly bodies are looking at this and saying that it's a reasonable and manageable safety risk.
Yeah. How long does it take to create a product once the cells have been collected?
Okay, so I guess if you mean by once the cells have been collected. That can mean two things. That can mean when you take the cell from a living, because you've got to get a cell from somewhere. If you take a cell from a living animal, if that means being collected, it almost it so a lot of the time they use cell lines, right? So you take a cell from an animal, but then you can keep those cells sort of sustained, alive, being the same by culturing them, and you can freeze them down and you can do all kinds of things. So, for example, the Singapore chicken nuggets were made with an avian, so a chicken cell line that had been produced for other purposes, I think in the 90s. So the actual animal was from decades ago, right? I don't quite think that's the spirit of the question, but I'm just giving it as a way into the question. It would so it depends on the passaging rates. It depends how big a product you wanted to produce. But I think we're sort of talking months, that kind of date. If you're talking about collecting the cells, as in taking the cells as they've been cultured out of a bioreactor, so that's one of the things you need to do. You put them in these big vats with this media, then you need to separate from the media. From that point, I would have thought it's not too long a process, because the cells at that point are sort of fresh. I mean, the cells, they're no longer alive, or you don't want them to be alive. I mean, there were reports recently that found live cells in chicken breasts that were sold in Tesco's. I think that's true, or one of the major. I don't think they said which supermarket. So cells do live on in meat products, but normally your meat products are meant to be dead. So you want the cells to come out of the bioreactor and be dead. But then it's an issue of processing them, and you would want to do that relatively quickly while they're still fresh for eating.
And I guess they're getting more sophisticated in terms of that they potentially then grow different types of cell to get flavor into the product by, having a certain percentage of fat cells as well as
That's definitely an area of interest. There's a UK company called Hoxton Farms that focus on fat, and there's others around the world.
Perhaps we have time for just one more question, Neil. For an investor wishing to put money in, is there a good case to invest in cultured meat versus plant-based meat? So where are you going to put your money?
Yeah, well, the boring answer is it probably depends which type of an investor you are. So historically, and this is perhaps beginning to change, but people who invest in cultured meat normally have, God, this is probably a much more boring answer than you wanted, but it's true. They would normally have an investment portfolio. So certainly the early venture capital companies, they would invest in the typical models that you invest in kind of 10 high risk companies, and you hope that one of them makes at least 10 times the amount that you invest to cover all the others. Yeah. And I think cultured meat is still in the high risk kind of space. It may be on the market soon for some companies, but it's not going to be at scale for, I mean, 5 years, 10 years, maybe more. Depends how you define scale as well. Scale can mean so many different things. Yeah. And then profitability. Whereas like a plant-based meat company, there's lots of them available. They're making money now. And if you get a good one, you can make money. I think in plant-based, what we've seen pre-pandemic, there was lots of new plant-based meat companies coming along with new versions of sausages or whatever. There seems to be less now. There seems to be more consolidation, and you're seeing, I'm saying this is impressionistic. I don't have stats to back this up, but you're certainly seeing a lot more like major companies like Tesco's or meat retailers or big food production companies bringing out their own brands, which I think sometimes they buy the smaller companies, sometimes they just make similar products. But I think you're seeing a smaller number of startup companies that are at least visible in the UK market right now. So there's been some changes there. But if you want a quick buck, plant-based, if you're prepared to take a risk and wait, cultured meat might be your investment.
Like sound advice. Perhaps just one last question. There's one more question showing up here, and I guess it goes back to some nutritional aspects of cultured meat. I guess this question is related to the potential down the road. Is that with cultured meat, we have a leaner product, and there's scope for healthier living and potentially weight loss, I think is what the question's alluding to. So is that fair to say?
There's this idea that you can engineer nutrition into it. I mean, at the same time, you can make leaner meats now it's not like livestock meat is this kind of, untouched straight from the animal thing. There's lots of work Okay, I'm back
Yeah,
much
you're
more
back.
quickly
Yeah,
this
yeah.
time, but let's hope that doesn't happen again. Um, um, uh, uh, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you can certainly make it with less fat to make it leaner. I mean, some people think we need more fat, right? Or certain types of fat, and that's part of the vision, but that's a possibility. But as I say, that really the vision right now is to make meat exactly as we know it. And the reason they want to do this is the model for changing the world. The idea is the world will be a better place if people stop eating livestock meat and eat this meat instead. And the strategy within the community is that the best way to do that is to make people buy cultured meat without even thinking about it. They're just buying the meat that's there. They're not actively buying into something different. They're not actively buying into an ethical meat or a healthier meat. They're just buying good, cheap meat. That's the vision. Whether it will happen, that's an open question. But it's about the vision is to make meat as we know it today, just made differently.
Excellent. I think that's a really excellent note to finish off on this evening, Neil. We've anecdotally had some really nice comments coming in on the chat, how much people have appreciated your presentation this evening.
Great.
I'm sure it's for many, it's their first insights into this field, myself included. So it'll be fascinating to see how this field does develop in the coming year. So many thanks once again for an outstanding presentation this evening. I'd just like to remind our audience that we're very keen to get feedback for this evening's lecture. And you will shortly be receiving a link to Mentimeter that will hopefully allow you to provide us with some feedback to this evening's presentation. So once again, thanks for our audience for their excellent questions this evening, and to Neil again for giving up his time this evening to provide us with this tremendous talk. So we're back again next month on Thursday, the 7th of December, with a talk by Dr. Cheney Drew from Cardiff University. And she will be talking about when the drugs don't work, how can advanced therapies be used to treat neurodegenerative disease. So hopefully we'll see many of you again back here next month. Diolch fawr iawn. Nos da. Good night now. Bye-bye.